Yeah, well, when they were catching cooter in New Beena at the peak of the cooter run there, they caught most of them in an old barge called the Friendship. And she was a leaky old thing, and she finally had reached the end of her days, and Grandfather Bridge thought he must get a bigger cooter boat built, and that's when the Storm Bay, the idea of getting this bigger boat was born. And somehow or another he organised with Perc Coverdale to build this 52-foot cooter boat. And that was the boat that I first saw when I was about 3 years old. She would only been about 8 years old then, and she was the apple of everyone's eye, and she was maintained and cared for like a yacht. And when you've got a sort of a workhouse, which the boat was, it's pretty hard and extra work to maintain them at such a high standard when it's got to be pretty rough work that the boat's got to do. And anyway, when they got the Storm Bay launched, then they beached that old barge in Parsons Bay there. And the Storm Bay, when she was built, she had no sponson on her. And where the jetty was exposed like to sharp northeasters across Parsons Bay. An old Grandfather Bridge thought he'd better get a sponson put on her. And then when his sponson was on her so that she'd stand the chafing at the end of the wharf while she was unloading, he didn't like the look of it. It sort of spoilt this rather pristine look about the boat, this aesthetic smoothness that she had. She was a beautiful looking boat, and still is, no doubt. But she was, and when we were kids, you know, we knew that the Storm Bay was something out of the box. When we went near her, we weren't allowed to touch anything. We weren't allowed to, and nobody was allowed aboard with nails in the bottom of their shoes, like every farmers and people those days had tacked-on soles on their shoes. And if anybody came near like this, went to get aboard, we'd ask them if they had nails in their shoes. And if they did, they'd take their shoes off and walk about the boat in their socks. This was a hewn pine deck. The hewn pine was top material for a boat for the top sides and that, but it wasn't very hard wood to work and wear and carry and throw boxes and one thing and another about on. So it was every time we went on the slip, all the spars were scraped, oiled and varnished. You can imagine the other boats, you know, they'd put a bit of mutton bird oil occasionally on a spar, paint the masthead, no paint on the Storm Bay's masthead. The deck always sandstoned off, like brand new, and then oiled, 2 coats of linseed oil on the deck.
Where'd you get the sandstone from?
When we wanted a bit of sandstone, we'd find it on the shore somewhere, different places, around in Port Arthur, where we might have went ashore or grab a couple of bits of sandstone, but it wasn't a scarce article, sandstone. It was never any problem to get sandstone.
So you'd be on your knees.
Holy stone, yeah. It'd take us a full day to holy stone the deck and wash it off, and then it had to stay overnight till it was nice and dry, and then we'd plaster the linseed oil over the deck. We'd do that just before we were coming off the slip. Sometimes we used to slip the boat twice a year. When we slipped the boat, not like today, when that boat came out of the water, mostly on the Domain slip, so they would immediately put bilge blocks underneath astern of the well. 2 long 10x4s would be put from the ground level at the slip on either side of the counter. We would immediately put the anchor and all the chain down on the slipway, and put a short billet of wood under the stem and to support the boat as much as we could, considering she was out of the water. Well, nowadays they just put those sides, well, virtually they put them on a cradle and stop them falling over, and that's it. But every boat, you know, especially older wooden boats, had to be cared for. They still don't do it, but your boat doesn't last very long. You get leaks and twists and things slowly move in them if you don't look after them properly.
And did you have to wet the decks every day?
There wasn't a day with a storm by that somebody didn't throw water on the deck. It was no problem to us when we were away at sea, but when we came to town, we'd take it in turns, morning, sometimes and night too in the summertime. We'd have to get in the dinghy. We never ever had a mooring for the storm boat. We wouldn't trust a mooring. We'd drop the anchor when we're up in Newtown Bay there. Drop the anchor in that black, thick, sludgy mud. You'd still be washing it overboard when you come away, when you came back to town after a week away. But we'd throw the salt water on this deck to stop the pitch seams or the deck shrinking and making a leak through the deck. You couldn't muck about with a boat. When she was sold, when Dad and them gave up the sea, the fellow that bought her was living at Port Sorell and fishing out of St Helens. And he'd tie the boat up at St Helens and go to Port Sorell and stay home there for a week or a month or whatever and just leave the boat tied up to the wharf. And because that was the beginning, the end of the decks, and quite often the top sides and that, they're not used to being out of the water, being dry for so long. Yes, when she was launched, she had a 15 horsepower Kelvin kerosene engine, you know. But when I first started going away myself, just after the war, and when Grandfather Bridges' wife died, they decided to, because the family, the boys were getting older, they cut so much off the mast, they took it an opportunity to change things about. And Len Nettlefeld, the car dealer bloke, he had an agency for diesel engines, and we bought a diesel engine for the Inez and for the Storm Bay. They're probably two of the worst engines that ever was sold anywhere in the world, diesel engines. They were Ailsa Craig's high revving engines. And although the Inez had reduction gear, Grandfather Bridge wouldn't allow them to cut the Storm Bay's deadwood away to make room for this big propeller. They always fancied the boat, you know, as a sailing job. He loved to sail, old Grandfather Bridge, because they was pretty good boatmen, they all were. But you can't really, he definitely had an idea of this Storm Bay being a sailing vessel. And it was really the end of sailing vessels, like with the windjammers. It was more to reduce the masts and rigging and sails and get to a diesel engine where you could get from port to the fishing banks and back in quickly without any waiting for the weather, or adverse weather didn't worry you. But not so with the Storm Bay. We wanted to always to look nice and be ready to sail if we had to. We never ever carried any insurance on the boats. The insurance was their sail. You know, they'd never ever get anywhere, especially the Storm Bay. We'd never go anywhere in any sort of weather that you couldn't get out of it under sail. We never trusted the engine. And just as well we did a few times, but nowadays, of course, most of those diesel engines are as reliable as the sun rising.
So did you do much sailing with her when you were making
Not a
the
lot,
voyage?
no, not a lot. She was such a powerful sailing vessel that, you know, when you had the fish in the well and a dinghy on deck and nets and pots, most often a cooter chute, a boat like the Storm Bay, she'd dive under 2 or 3 waves, the next thing the whole lot would be overboard. You've got to have a clear deck for a vessel that wants to sail. But with a double reef sail on her, like in a staysail, if there was a fair wind, we'd always make use of the wind with her. She's pretty slippery boat, she was, but I never ever saw her tested with the full sails and one thing and another on. They did, when she was about 8 years old, 2 or 3 years old, Grandfather Bridge still owed one of his friends, Perc Willing, a butcher bloke. He'd borrowed £300 off Perc Willing to finish the boat. She cost more than they were expecting. And when it came time for Grandfather Bridge to pay Perc Willing this £300, Perc Willing suggested that they take the Storm Bay on a trip to Sydney to watch the Foster Cup, where the Tassies were racing, the famous Tasmanian yachts. And with 5 or 6 of these business friends, well-to-do people, they set off and took the Storm Bay to Sydney for 2 or 3 months. And she created a bit of a stir there in Sydney. This big fishing smack, handsome boat from Tasmania. And Grandfather Bridge, although he couldn't read or write, he was sort of fancied himself amongst the gentry when he could get away with it. Like the glass or the best of the brandy and one thing or another he did. Well, the Storm Bay was launched on the 21st of July 1925, and she had 2 write-ups in the Mercury. I've still got the printouts from the Mercury in there. But old Grandfather Bridge was pretty much an individualist. He was never one to sort of curry favour with the gentry and the establishment, although they had lots of friends amongst the yachting fraternity. And he used to get, although he was reasonably ignorant of legal principles and things, some lawyers that, there was a Judge Hutchins, used to be a regular visitor to him in New Bena there when they had the smoke houses, and a fellow named Russell Young was another lawyer who helped him get the lease of the fish market. They did a lot of operating from the fish market in Victoria Dock. That was a big market built by the City Council for auctioning of fish for the benefit of fishermen about in the early 1900s, where they could bring their fish in and auction them there. And what was I going to say? Yes, and when Casmatty and Boutle came here as fish buyers, there was no need for the auctioning of the fish. Quite a lot of the fishermen aligned themselves with Casmatty or Boutle or old Bill Burnett, and their fish were sold before they got them to town. So that then this fish market was standing there empty, and Grandfather Bridge must have had his eye on it and thought he'd lease it, and after a lot of struggling he was able to get a lease on it. The City Council were loath to lease it because he wanted some of the wharf near it, you know, for the boats to come and go and moor there and have a punt, a live fish punt moored there. But he finally succeeded in getting a lease for it, and they began selling fish and chips, and then to a lesser extent they had a dining room. It was quite famous all around the world really, with apple boats and people, you know, ships coming from England. There weren't that many tourists, but most of those big shore saddle boats and that would have some passengers aboard, and the seamen and the crews off the boats would come there, and you could go down to this live fish punt and select the fish swimming about and say, yes, I'd like that, and they'd hit it on the head and fillet it, and within half an hour you'd have it on your plate. And it was quite a famous worldwide type of an operation. Yes, Grandfather Bridge, he wanted he won a regatta in the Innes. And when he got to Storm Bay, he thought he was going to clean up, but she only sailed in, I think, one regatta, and it was almost a flat calm, and she came second. They still got the silks, from it. But it was great fun. They were really competitive. But mind you that they had to sail. There were virtually no engines. When Grandfather Bridge was a boy, there was no internal combustion engine. And then my dad said when he was a kid, there was no internal combustion engine. Before he died, they put a man on the moon. So things were really moving along, sometimes faster than the people could sort of live with. But she was very fast sailing. We didn't have many sails on her because she was what old Grandfather Bridge said was a powerful boat. Tim will find this out if he gets her well rigged and a full set of sails on her. He'll know that he's on a boat. It's surprising, really. But no boat. When we'd be out cootering, if it was a strong wind, come up out in the middle of Storm Bay there, and the boats would, shake their reefs out and one thing and another to go in the Storm Bay. Would be in there 20 minutes before any of them got near the shore. But my Big George, we used to call his dad's brother Big George because he was a big lump of a man. But he used to dread it. He liked to sail himself, but when you finished tying everything down on deck, you'd be almost in out of it. But I should imagine they'll have a bit of fun with her under sail. She's a lot steadier under sail, she will be, than without the sail, because she's got a very round, curvy bottom, like Marilyn Monroe a bit, and she'll, without the sail on, to steadier on one tack. They'll know she's been swaying about a bit under their feet.
Yes.
I wouldn't have missed it for quids. I wouldn't. It nearly broke my heart to give it away when I was about 31 in 1961 when I got married, because really being away, just married and being away from the shore and your wife got to look after the family and one thing and another like that. It's not the best of a life. And as Dad and George and Joe and Turk, the four brothers, were coming to they're all approaching the mid-60s, and they hadn't offered me a continuing job, to take one of the boats, or never even encouraged me to get a boat of my own. I sort of just let it stop. But I've never lost interest in any of it. I'm always interested in the fish and all the mistakes that the fisheries bureaucracy still makes. They've been making since time began. I try my best to correct them and put them on a straight course occasionally. They mostly take notice of me, but they hate to think that anybody that wasn't an academic would know more about their controls and fish stocks and one thing and another than I did.
Are you looking forward to the Storm Bay coming back here?
I definitely am. I'm not looking forward to being sort of marooned on her, coming away for a ride for a day, Jim, and find yourself there for a bloody week somewhere. But no, I'll be interested to see what Tim thinks of her. He's going to find that she's pretty lively underfoot. When I used to come off the Storm Bay to go scalloping on the Innes, it was like a holiday to go on the Innes. She had a big bottom compared to the top sides, our smaller boat, and she was quite steady in a seaway, where the Storm Bay occasionally you'd think you could have suckers on your feet like a fly so you could hold on the deck. She'd fling herself about, and because she was a different kettle of fish all the time with a sail on her. But if there were strong winds, and you weren't drifting about like with reduced sail after barracudas. Then the sail was a problem. You had to have good rigging, and we used to let the rigging get a bit sloppy, because it became quite expensive rigging. And most of the time the rigging was there just to hold the double reef sail up. Most of our barracuda fishing was done under double reef sail.
So tell us about that picture on the wall there.
That we were grab-hauling up at Slopin Island, catching quite a lot of silver trumpeter there. They were fish about 13 inches long. What's that? 330 millimetres or something nowadays. But that was a great place. You could work up in, we used to call that up inside, up in the quieter sections of the Storm Bay when it was stormy, and when you was up at slope, and it didn't matter how much of a big ocean swell was on, you was sheltered from it up there, and you could work up there when you couldn't work out on the shores of Storm Bay. You had to have the weather a bit near the mark for setting grab hauls. You couldn't have too much sea on. Couldn't have too much wind because you had to be able to row the dinghy. You had to watch out when your nets were down. We only had the one lot of nets. You had to be prepared for any changes in the weather, that you could get your nets up quickly, then nets aboard the boat, and then the dinghy aboard. I remember when I was seeing yesterday's Mercury that the ship's stern bluff, a photographer was out filming the fellas. It's got one of the biggest breaks around Tasmania. It's this long, shallow sandstone reef, and these big waves come tearing in. And on the edge of that, where they are, they don't know. What we do was one of the best real trumpeter shots for a net ever been. Grandfather Bridge said he got 10 dozen out of a net there once, alongside where this big break is. It's something to do with what the trumpeter are doing there. And we got 17 dozen out of a net there in the same place. But that was a place where on a hot day, it was with the wind northerly, it was off the shore. But as the day got on to about 1 or 2 o'clock and the sea breeze had want to come in, you had to be prepared. You wanted to stay there as long as you could with your nets down, but then you'd have to be able to get, when the wind come whistling in, you'd have to be able to get your nets up quickly, and the dinghy on deck, and the Storm Bay would have to come in there, and we'd be rolling in the boat, drifting, blowing towards the shore. We're trying to get this dinghy aboard, and then you'd breathe a sigh of relief when you turned and headed out away from the moor or the rocks waiting to claim you.
Did you have any bad frights, Jim?
Bad
frights?
We did. We've had some. We've had a few close calls there. Sometimes you took your life in your hands. The worst fright ever I got on the Storm Bay. We were coming in from Maria Island with a fairly big easterly sea on, and it tends to break quite heavily on that Marion Bay Narrows there. And we were coming right in there, and we didn't ever like taking the Storm Bay near a bar because they're bad news. And we were just about, we said we would watch there was a reef away astern out in the long reef, a shallow rock, and you'd count the wave. When that broke, you'd say, well, that's the biggest sea that's coming for about 7 or 8, and we only wanted about 2 minutes to get over this bar. And just as we started to come in, when it was too late to turn back, there was a massive heap of drift kelp right in front of the boat. And we were trying to dodge this big heap of drift kelp because of we had a bit of centreboard down to give the boat extra manoeuvrability in a seaway. And the water drew back from under the Storm Bay like as this massive sea was coming. And I thought to myself, this is it. and the sea broke under her, and she shot straight ahead towards what we thought was disaster, and there was water creaming over the boat all the way around her. She settled in the top of this massive sea, and then the sea spent itself, and we were right in the channel, and it left us, and we just sort of motored on up into the quiet water of the channel. And I swear my heart began to beat about 5 minutes afterwards. That's a piece of marlin. We used to use it on the boat for seizing any laps or foals with splices in the rigging. When I get a bit homesick for the sea, I always pick that up and rub it in my fingers and smell it. It's loaded with Stockholm tar. It's Italian hemp, penetrated, soaked in Stockholm tar. That was the smell of the boat. All the splices, all the edges, everything about a boat smelled of Stockholm tar. More so the sailing ships, the rigging and one thing and another. It was specially laid up material so that you wound it round something, and you had to have a special sort of a fid to pull it round and tighten it and lever it, and it wouldn't slip after you got it in position. Then you could pull it and wind it through its own part, and it would hold loose ends down, carry a man's weight quite easily. When they, the ratlins, like a ladder up the rigging of a boat, all those cross pieces like the rungs of a ladder were all wound on with marlin. As soon as you sniff that, you look over the stern to see that you're not going to poop one. Yeah. Something about it takes you back.
So over a 10-year period, Tim restored the Storm Bay, and her maiden voyage was to the 2007 Australian Wooden Boat Festival in Hobart. We had arranged to meet with them in Fortescue Bay, one of Jim's old haunts. Storm Bay spent a lot of time sheltering there in her younger day. Tim picked Jim up in Triabunna and brought him around, so Jim had a few days on board, and we had a nice couple of days. Look at a couple of very contented men, Tim and Jim. Tim the new owner, and Jim the old decky, who fished on her for 14 years and had a lot of good advice. Here we are rafted up, just inside the wreck there, up in Canoe Corner at Fortescue. What a beautiful spot. Old Jim having a bit of lunch, sitting on a little stool. I bet there weren't too many stools on the Storm Bay in the early days. Finally we set sail for Hobart. It's Colin Anderson on the jib. He made the sails, going around the lanterns, squaring away for Tasman Island. And we meet up with the fleet, and the sail passed on the Friday afternoon. I got Bob Stone up forward on Umarella to take this photo of Storm Bay sailing through the fleet, Hobart bound. Col Anderson's sails doing a beautiful job. She created a lot of interest in Hobart and returned to her old stomping grounds, as she should. The 1925 classic fishing smack, Storm Bay returns.